It's a very peculiar thing to focus on because we're used to London being a kind of a very, in the last 30 years, a very busy and singular marketplace for fine art exhibitions are numerous, and the writing on art is numerous, but it's not always been like that. So we spent the first part of the century looking across to Paris, and then the second half looking across to New York, and only more recently has become its own center, as it were. Vanda, you can start.
Okay. This narrativizes an account of one city in one extended period. Firstly, we have artists traveling to London to create an image of their awakening to the visual spectacle or flux of it. Then we are subject to different forms of immersion into recording different life experiences that are given by occupying different zones of the city and the various social formations. This is followed by how the city is not just a setting, but a state of mind, or the sensation of images in circulation. With this, the notion that lines are drawn within city spaces, which the form networks of sense. What is a city other than a vast grid that opens and closes onto different possibilities? James Whistler was an American artist whose working life was mainly based in England. His painting explored the parallel between painting and music, and his titles are a reflection of this. Harmonies, nocturnes, arrangements, with each a reflection of art for art's sake.
This is Whistler. Whistler was painted very contrary to was hated by the academic establishment, particularly those involved in the RA. And he was famously taken to court or to a court case, where he was awarded a penny for damages. He threw a pot of paint at the was his canvas.
So he was also 19th century, was he?
Century. But it's the first attempt to make a portrait of the city in a way which is quite abstracted, and it's followed by Monet in 1899.
In 1899, Claude Monet travelled to London and booked a room in the Savoy Hotel with a balcony view over the River Thames, close to the Houses of Parliament. Whether or not he had anticipated the effects of fog on the visual scene is not really apparent, but his developing fascination with it was, for he felt compelled to revisit on several occasions. Monet did not finish by painting in situ, but took all the paintings back to be completed in his studio in France. So in this sense, they combined impressionism related to rapidly changing weather conditions with the memory of those formations. This then gave rise to a more mediative sensation of the image in which the perception was balanced with construction. There was no domestic artist who appeared to be in place in order to conjure a series of works on the scale of this undertaking. So, despite the fact that the subject was London, the capacity was Paris, and that established a relationship between the two cities as far as the visual arts were concerned for a significant number of decades.
I mean, there's a show at the Courtauld of these paintings, and they're a little bit unlike any other Monets. They're very thin paint. They're blurred, but they're very thin. There's a lot of glaze, and they shimmer, and they're not quite impressionism. They're more abstracted than that, and more meditative in a way. Should have been meditative, not meditized.
What was at stake in these interventions of London as a visual spectacle was that it opened out onto a sensitivity of being a looked upon entity, or as a city as forming an image of itself as if new.
And it's followed several years later, a few years later, Darian went to. Um, there was the Monets were shown in Paris, and attracted a great deal of attention. And Darren decided to go to London to follow suit, but he did it in a way which is quite different, much more. Whereas the Monets are subdued and subtle. These are Fauve's paintings. Fauvism is this idea of the has this sort of idea of wild. Uh,
André Derain came to London in 1906 in order to follow Claude Monet's then celebrated views of the city. Whereas Monet had presented his views of the city through a haze, Derain employed an unrestrained use of pure colour which characterised the Fauvist movement. Vollard, his dealer, purchased the entire group of 30 paintings in what appeared as a vibrant setting afforded by views of London. It was certainly a demonstration of a form of visual modernity which was confident in its own speculative drive. Abject Hidden London, Sickert, Jack the Ripper's Bedroom, 1906 to 7.
so tonally, I mean, Sickert travelled to Paris and was friends with some of the Impressionists, particularly Degas. I think Degas owned, they swapped paintings, uh, but they're very subdued, and it's what was known as the Camden Town Group. So it was local to an area, working class area of London. It wasn't a kind of view of a city, it was much more a view of a neighbourhood.
Walter Sickert was one of the suspects related to a whole series of murders in Whitechapel and Camden Town. In the painting 1908, he depicts the Camden Town murder, and this was part of a whole number of works that he produced of scenes of such crimes. The crimes were never solved, but the paintings became a source of the speculation connected to these notorious events. Sickert forged a relationship with French artists of the period, and in particular with Degas.
That's one of those Jack the Ripper paintings.
Glass was a short-lived modernist magazine that was founded by Wyndham Lewis with Ezra Pound. There was 2 issues published in 1914 and 1915, which served as journals for Vorticism. This movement was opposed to the academic establishment which had prevailed in London and linked its sense on politics with that of aesthetic modernity.
So they were very influenced by Futurism and Marinetti, but they found Marinetti too bombastic. So it's a different view of Futurism. But it was short lived. It was like a sort of a sudden surge, and there's only two publications.
When was the First World War? What year would it start?
I think 1914 was it?
Like 1914 to 18 or 19 or something. I can't quite remember, but is that why? I mean, I'm just sort of thinking of the one on the right and the word blast, I guess, all related.
I mean, Futurism was a celebration initially of war, um, until a lot of the painters started getting killed in the trenches.
David Bomberg connected with the dynamism of forces and forms created by the advent of modernity. His teaching role played an important role with the later generation.
I think he taught mainly at Camberwell. It was an important source for some of the some of the exiled painters coming to London, associated closely with his sense of modernity and his more continental approach to painting. This is Jacob Epstein, who for a short while was very influenced by Vorticism. which was mounted on a real drill support.
Jacob Epstein produced the work Rock Drill, 1913 to 15, as part of an intuition of a world to come. My ardour for machinery, short-lived, expended itself upon the purchase of an actual drill, second-hand, and upon it I made and mounted a machine-like robot, visored, menacing, and carrying within itself its progeny, protectively ensconced. Here is the armed, sinister figure of today and tomorrow. No humanity, only the terrible Frankenstein's monster we have made ourselves into. Camden Town's group formed as a response to local experience within the city. It was a minor realist depiction of a given location, as opposed to a response to the more abstract ways of depicting modernity.
This is a Sickert painting. Sickert was one of the first artists who conveyed scenes of popular culture, the music hall and vaudeville and early cinema. This is a fragment of a painting. But he embraced a sort of, at least a sort of idea of popular culture within the city.
Vanessa Bowell, the other room, 1930s. The Bloomsbury Group was a state of mind as opposed to a location, the city opening itself to expansion of modes of interiority. This, in turn, was a site for both the literary and the visual modes of reflection. Bohemia, then, was nothing other than the self-consciousness of this sensitivity to processes of reflection. Attention was paid as much to the minor modes of decorative design as processes of other, more major aesthetic predilections.
That's an abstract painting by Vanessa. So she painted both figurative paintings and these abstract paintings, which was, she was married to Clive Bell, the art critic. And so she was exposed a lot to prevailing French modernity.
Roger Fry, Clive Bell, 1924, Roger Fry, self-portrait, 1928. They look quite different. Oh, I see one's Clive Bell. The one's, yeah, okay. Clive Bell was a member of the Bloomsbury Group and, as an art critic, developed a notion of significant form that was developed as part of a formalist understanding of aesthetic theory. Roger Fry played a significant role in developing a critical response to post-impressionism to the public in England. His emphasis was on the formal properties of painting, and with this developed a modernist approach to art.
So they're the first to really understand implications of particularly French modernity and give it an English setting, which was this small kind of almost aristocratic group based in Charleston, in Sussex, and in Bloomsbury. It was very, very close to literary concerns. So,
Okay, I'm sorry, I've got to go. My mum's just calling out. Can someone else take over? Could someone else take over, please?
Sharon, could you take over?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Words are an impure medium. Better far to have been born into a silent kingdom of paint. Virginia Woolf, 1934.
So she is a sister of Vanessa Bell.
I think they also mentioned at Charlton too. Weren't they the first to have had a Picasso in the country as well? It had come in through the dealers, so they had that on the wall down there at one point in the room.
Had what?
The first to have a Picasso painting in the country.
Yeah.
The Euston Road School was based upon a reaction to modernist abstraction that was instead based upon principles on observation. It was closely associated with the Slade School, and with this a method of constructing drawing. William Coldstream was the leading figure of this school, both as a professor at the Slade, but also as an intellectual voice within the art world.
This is a painting, it's a small image of a painting he did of the train station just off um, Euston Road. This is a Coldstream painting. This is Ewan Uglow, who's much later, post-war painter, who kind of developed it to its farthest extent, and after he died, it tended to the whole movement tended to collapse.
Yuan Yuglo was the culmination of a school that largely stood out for a resistance to all the differing fluxes of an ever-changing modernity. It was a method of finding a correspondence between what was observed with an exact procedure with a single painting, sometimes taking years of close attention to finalize the study.
So it's almost as if it was a defiance of modernity, although it's very close to it. Really, his chief object of admiration was Cézanne. But it's
Henry Moore served as a war artist, and many of his drawings focused on the subject of people taking refuge from the nightly bombing, which was termed the Blitz. London became the home of a whole number of artists due to the rise of Nazism and political repression in Europe, becoming an object of visual fascination with all its World War II scarring, as if to serve an ongoing private memory of being in exile.
it really changed the London art world. This influx of exiles, not just the art world, but the whole intellectual world. You know, you got Freud, scientists coming, Popper, Karl Popper. You got art historians coming. Um, so it had an enormous impact upon the both the intellectual milieus which formed in London and also the aesthetic milieus.
This is Frank Auerbach's Morning Crescent with statue of Sickat's father-in-law, 111, 1966.
So Frank Auerbach painted every day. I mean, he just died this year. But he more or less painted every day for the whole of his time in London, and chose the setting of London as his setting for paintings. Didn't travel outwards. He didn't go on long holidays painting or anything like that. Painted London scenes every day.
I've been wandering around these streets for so long that I've become attached to them, and as fond of them as people become fond of their pets. This part of London is my world. I used to travel further for my subjects, to the cinema up the road, to Euston Station and to St Pancras Station. And 40 years ago, I worked from building sites at St Paul's in Victoria Street and Oxford Street. But in those days, I would work from 5 or 6 drawings, and now I get through 200 sketches for a painting. I'm more dependent on my subject. Essentially, I hope to record something here too, unrecorded. Frank Auerbach, 1988. 98.
For those, we did a visit to the his exhibition in Courtauld of his charcoal drawings from this, particularly from the 50s.
This is an early portrait of Bacon by Freud. This tightly woven network stood as a resistance to the idea of forming a movement, but instead wished to make manifest a sensation of recording ways of being.
That's Freud and Bacon together in West End. And they tended to paint each other quite a lot. They used each other as subjects, either through taking photographs or through memory. This is a portrait of Lucian Freud. Again, there's an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery of Freud's portraits, Bacon's portraits. There they are at the eating together. this photograph was used at an exhibition of four great painters at the Gagosian Gallery. So rather than being a movement, it was a kind of network of friendships. There was very little to other than this network of stylistically they were not necessarily unified, but the relationship to the studio and to painting and the way of making a network out of their aesthetic predilections were what drew them together.
There was a trace of surrealism in the early paintings of Freud, but it was the sense of intensity of the subject that was to be a mark of his embrace of an existential tinged realism. Lucian Freud, Girl with a Kitten, 1947. Michael Andrews, The Colony Room, number 1. The 1960s saw an experimental employment of materials which reflected industrial processes of fabrication. Steel, perspex, glass, fibre, aluminium were utilised alongside new commercial colours. St. Martin's School of Art was central to these experiments in what was termed the New Generation. The sculptures of Anthony Caro and Philip King exemplified this movement, which reflected a New York aesthetic predilection towards visual purity as a feature of its presentation. Alongside sculpture, there was an exploration of colour-filled painting with an adoption of New York-based work serving as the main influence. The opening out of the dock spaces served to facilitate this ambitious employment of scale.
Anthony Caro. With Philip King. This is John Hoyland. John Hoyland was very closely attached to New York painters rather than London-based painters. And he was one of the major painters of the 70s. This is a image of the ICA, the exhibition in 1969 of When Attitudes Become Form, in which Harold Seaman, the Swiss creator, put together a show of American, German, British, and Italian mainly conceptually based art, process-based, minimalism and conceptualism put together. But it was a groundbreaking show. It really was the first to break with formless ways of hanging work. It was like a kind of disorganized skip on first sight. Looked very chaotic, but it's very influential, this show. Not many people saw it, but it had a really lasting, profound influence. It was one of the shows which has sustained its reputation through all these years.
The exhibition When Attitude Becomes Form was staged at the ICA in 1969, drawing together conceptual, process, and minimalist work under one umbrella. It was also an experiment in how to present work was generated by new media and the idea. The exhibition looked like no other exhibition at the time, with its informality being a seeming attribute. In art schools, an aesthetic choice open out between American formalism, conceptual art, and academic-based work. Within a number of years, teaching became predicated upon what was the main question of the inquiry being conducted, as opposed to questions pertaining to stylistic orientation.
So it led to a kind of almost a 30-year period in which the main question was always, what is your idea? What's your question? This was very different from the previous period, which is much more based upon stylistic questions and particularly formless questions. When I went to the Slade in '69, the postgraduate studio was just filled with people doing hard edge paintings, and the main question was, do you use masking tape or not? I mean, it was a serious question. It seems a joke now, but it was a serious preoccupation, and formalism had seemed to come down to that sort of level of um, almost very forgettable speculative content. Just did it look good? Did it look right? Very little of the armature more formal aesthetic theory remained. So conceptual art seemed to sort of offer a vigor or a kind of rereading of texts. And
So sorry, Jonathan, who was the curator that was involved in
What
that?
is ICA?
it was at the ICA, and it was in '69. It was Harold Seaman, who did a legendary show at the next documentary, I think in '72 or '70, I think it was '72, where he showed boys, and it's a spectacular documentary. That was one of the most referred to documentaries in the post-war years.
So
Question, I missed it. What is ICA?
Institute of Contemporary Art.
Thanks.
where was he coming from, Jonathan, to be able to break the mold like that and to actually propose such an extraordinary exhibition?
Well, he travelled a lot, knew a lot of the artists personally. So he travelled around Europe and America just talking to artists and putting together a show. I mean, I don't know where he got the funds from, but he was very respected. He would talk to artists and just say, "What do you want to do?" and let them do it. He was a sort of facilitator. Um, I met him with David Medulla in 68, I think it was, 69, no, it was 69, just after when attitudes become form. And he was discussing the documentary, and he just sort of had a free roving idea, just do what you want to do it to the biggest extent you can do it. So he is very good at working with artists, not controlling artists, letting artists develop according to their whim. It tended to work out. This is John Latham, 1 second drawing.
Jonathan, can I just ask about that? So, what was the sort of what was behind the move from aesthetic questions to conceptual ideas?
Well, it was a reaction against. I mean, in the '60s, a lot of the minimalist artists and the early conceptual artists started to write about their own work. So they didn't like the idea of a master thinker or master creator. So they saw Greenberg had a predilection towards Kantian theory, and wrote more or less from analytical philosophy, particularly Wittgenstein. So it almost went into logical positivism, and the idea was almost the least event which something can become a work of art. So like this is a pile of sand, or John Latham is just a 1 second drawing. So everyone wanted to make the last work of art, as it were. So it was an overcoming of art. It was a kind of form of Hegelianism without Hegel, as it were. This is Victor Bergen's Photopath. And this work originated with just a typed out instruction. So he did sort of, I think, something like 10 propositions for works. And this one he enacted for the ICA. But you bought the instruction rather than the actual physical manifestation of the instruction. and Solowit was doing propositions for drawings. He would send a proposition, a speculation of what a drawing could become, and he'd get someone to enact the drawing on a wall of a gallery. So you bought the instruction, not the actual installation. The installation was painted over after the show. The Lisson Gallery was mainly associated with showing these works of art, which are not at all commercial. They didn't, nothing sold really very much.
That was scores, instruction scores was also kicking off in a sound art scene as well
Yeah.
at the same time.
Well, in music, you had musicians writing instructions, and
Yeah, Yoko Ono did it.
John Cage, obviously.
James did it, yeah.
Would someone else like to read?
Should I try? Modernism was modernism was a pursuit in the part of a limited modernism was a pursuit in part of a limited experience. John Lesson, with his 1 second drawings, Barry Flanagan, and his Pipe of Sand, Victor Burgeon, and his pursuit of a photography recording its own condition, are examples drawn from the spectrum of the practices of the conceptualism that emerged in 1960s. It was as if the least condition in which something could be named as being a work of art was the center of preoccupation. In this respect, this was a pursuit of aesthetic finality at age of end of art. The op art drawings, but rigid really. The op art paintings of a bridge really become emblematic of the interspace between art and fashion design. Op and pop dominated the more popular viewpoint on the modern spirit of the times, but one subject to the misunderstanding because the aesthetic pursuit was the one based on a serious the analysis of the art historical models. The middle 60s saw the rise of the swinging 60s and the advent of the counterculture. The cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album embodied his shift within the culture. In the 50s and early 60s, London was called the Smoke. This gave the way to a culture shift that generated a revolution of color. The image of the grey culture, marked by Bolden, was placed. Bolden was replaced by a shift towards a counterculture based upon Young's. Peter Brigg studied at ICA and he became one of the leading figures in the pop art.
This is The Who. Pete Townsend smashing up his guitar. And he went to Epsom School of Art, where auto-destructive art was sort of fashionable, particularly the work of He'll stop him. It's showing him here doing one of his acid paintings in public.
The auto-destructive art, Gustav Messenger,
That's good.
the Peter Townshend of the who had studied art at Ibsen College of Art and came into contact with the idea of auto-destruction in this period.
Metzger was famous for never having a. He was exiled from Germany from the Nazis, but he refused to have a passport. The Home Office gave him special dispensation not to have a passport. So he lived.
Where is it? This college?
He was very much a free floating figure. He was involved in signals gallery in the mid-60s. He never had a permanent job. So very much in the margins. But he had a forum called on auto-destructive art, which Yoko Ono attended, gave a presentation. So he's quite an important figure in the 60s.
Richard Hamilton became known as the godfather of pop art. Hamilton, Peter Blake, and David Hockney all produced iconic statements and commentaries of the time, but also become icons within the culture. Pop culture, fashion, and pop art all shared a close relationship, often in controversial moments, as in the image of the art dealer Robert Fraser and the Mick Jagger being arrested for the possession of the drugs.
There's a print he did of this moment. It was in the. It was taken as a newspaper image, but the police went on a kind of campaign to arrest pop stars and for smoking marijuana. Seems incredible now. They're threatened with imprisonment and
Was their work built on top of these drugs?
not really. I mean the counterculture was, I mean, mainly a place for LSD and marijuana, and Keith Richards was also took a lot of cocaine and heroin. And Marion Faithfull was Mick Jagger's girlfriend became a junkie, addicted to heroin. This is a film by Jean-Luc Godard, which features a Rolling Stones recording called "Sympathy for the Devil," and he used the London as a setting for this film, which was also called 1+1, which was featured in rehearsals of the Stones intercut with a series of constructed fragmentary tableaus. But London was almost a capital of, alongside LA, of counterculture in this period.
The performance 1970 was directed by Donna Comer and Nicholas Roeg. It stars Mick Jagger as a reclusive rock star and Jim Fox as a gangster who, after killing a friend, goes into the hiding with the rock star in a house in the Notting Hill Gate. The film is the form of the allegory of the outsider persona and creates the explicit links between the sexuality and the violence. It had major differences passing through the laws and censorship.
It was completed in 1968, but it wasn't allowed to be released till 1970. Um, so it had a sort of notorious uh, publicity lead. Uh, they had Mick Jagger in a menage a trois, the two women. There's scenes in a bath. There is with his two girlfriends, one of which is a girlfriend of uh, what's her name now? Forgot the name. Anita Pallenberg. Uh, went out with Keith Richards. So there's a sort of lot of jealousy between Keith Richards and Mick Jagger because of these sex scenes which are shot in this film. This is a photograph by David Bailey of Mick Jagger. So David Bailey was almost a court photographer of this aesthetic and aesthetic movement and counterculture. This is David Bailey with the model Jean Shrimpton, who was the main model in the 60s. She featured a lot in Vogue magazine. He almost generated the image out of, he used the model as a way of telling the story about cities. He took Jean Shrimpton to New York and photographed her in New York very famously.
David, David Bailey was the central figure in the shaping of the various personnel relating to the image of London of the period in the middle 60s to onwards. The film blew up. This is a Polish film, right? The film blew up by Michelangelo Antonioni was the part of in part based on the fashion photography that was based on the David Bailey. The film is based upon the accidental image shot by photographer and uncertainty related to what and how something might be read. Yes, this one.
So he thinks he sees a body in the shadows, and he doesn't know it's a shadow or a real body, and he gets involved in a kind of pursuit of a kind of photographic truth, which can't be solved. And no matter how much he blows up, the image disintegrates. As the narrative disintegrates in the end, he gets bored and gets on to another topic. This is David Hockney, the kind of icon. This is it's the most famous painting of the Tate Gallery of Ozzy Clarke and Celia Birtwell. Celia Birtwell was a kind of muse of David Hockney. He did numerous drawings of her, and he was friends with Ozzy Clarke, who was the main fashion designer of London at that time. He did clothes for all the pop groups and the aristocracy, but had unfortunate drug habits, which meant he eventually went bankrupt.
Hockney's painting of Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Patsy in 1971 became one of the most popular paintings in the Tate Gallery. Ozzy Clarke was one of the most celebrated fashion designer of the period, and Hockney formed a close relationship with the couple at with the couple at Royal College of Art. Celia Birtwell appeared in many Hockney's drawings and paintings of this period, serving as the muse-like figure.
That's Ozzy Clarke just doing. He kind of was a great cutter of cloth, So technically, he was very good. Otney admired his ability to do a drawing of a. He could cut out a glove without a template. He would just do a free form drawing and cut out the fabric and make a glove. Um, so I had a close relationship with. They had both a kind of close relationship to drawing.
The late 60s saw the rapid growth of what was termed the underground press. Ozzy was the most controversial and was famously charged under the obscenity law.
The children's Oz, um, but the main magazines were IT, Friends, Oz, um, but they're all related to opposition to Vietnam War and to liberalization of the drugs law and uh, free moving, free wielding relationship to sexual culture.
Gilbert and George came to the life with the idea of being living sculptures.
They used to do performances singing underneath the arches, so it's kind of uh, very much based upon. They had Savile Row suits on, so this sort of almost aristocratic persona of being gentlemen, but being in the art world, being transgressive. So there's this double relationship between appearance and reality.
And there's a show coming up soon at Haywood Gallery, I think, the Gilbert and George. Uh, Stuart Brisley established himself as a major figure of the performance art and influential teacher based in the Slade since 1970.
Is the Slade was interesting at that time because they had platforms. So Stuart Brisley taught performance and sculpture or installation based work. Ewan Hugo would teach live painting. Um, Malcolm Hughes would teach electronics and systems art. So they first developed this idea of different discrete platforms, but all with an experimental program attached to them.
Those English experiment Rose English exemplified the development of performance art and with this, the expansion of the informal art spaces.
At this time in the early 70s, London was very run down. There were massive squats. So all around, for instance, just off Euston Road, there were something like 30,000 squatters. Um, so I used to, with a group, have a studio which was 5,000 square feet. And we had this studio for 5 years free. So there's numerous informal spaces in which a lot of people did performance arts and installations, and so outside there wasn't very much commercial life in London as far as selling that art, but there was a lot of informal, almost do-it-yourself establishment of spaces and practices and crossovers between musicians and artists and photographers and writers.
David Medalla good at being squatters, I think.
David had a squat on.
At South Kensington in a luxury house, like a mansion house.
This is Victor Bergin. Um, what does wealth mean to you? he did a show in Newcastle, and he had these fly posters all around Newcastle as his artwork for this show. There's a lot of experiments to do with image text work at this time, and a lot of people reading Roland Barthes and Derrida and Freud, and so a lot of intellectual pursuit of the image and the relation between text and image, a kind of idea of a sort of deconstructive relationship to the image.
The ending of the influence of Greenbergian formalism was replaced by experiments in the different medias and with the different moods of thinking. The ideas often related to the continental philosophies such as structuralism, and deconstruction served to expand the way in which art was discussed. This introduced the idea of a deep reading of both the text and the image. Art theory largely replaced more formal art history in art school, and with these texts of Barthes and Derrida, the Christopher Lacan, Bachelard, Ballanchot, and Debord, Benjamin starts to adorn aces with the speculation was started to be the foundation of the new academy.
So you got to shift away from art history in art schools, particularly in St. Martin's, which did cultural studies or cultural theory, and so the wasn't so much art historically led as intellectually, a lot of French theory, and there were reading groups of around Lacan's writing, which was just being translated. Althusser was another one who his writings on Marx's Capital became subject of his reading groups, and Benjamin was particularly was just being translated. So a lot of these texts were quite rare. They were only just being translated in the early 70s.
Mary Keeley, The Post-Patron Documents, 1973 to 1979.
So she was part of a reading group on theories of Lacan. So she used the diagrammatic structure of Lacan to analyze her relationship to a child.
In 1976, the Hilda Gallery was a setting for an exhibition called The Human Clay that was based on the idea of a raw Kija, who perceived a counter movement to the fashionable aesthetic of the conceptual and the minimalist art with this counterpoint. He articulates a whole grouping of the painters whose work centered upon the figure and the drawing. This leads in turn to the idea that this was a form of the school which was termed the School of London. R.B. Kitat, the Oil Gang,
The gang.
1964.
So he's very close at this time to Hockney in the Royal College. He was older than Hockney, but Hockney really admired his drawing facility. That's a later key time.
Yes, Bacon, this figure.
Yeah.
The Clash.
He did an LP called London Calling.
The Clash developed and beyond punk into what they termed the combat rocket. They also formed a hybrid sound that fused reggae dub, a sound with the electronic rock. Their era assumed a aggressive political ethic
Ethos.
ethos as a model, sorry, as a mode of resistance to racialism and right-wing ideologies.
Around 1979, they were massive in the United States. They toured the States to massive responses. I mean, they were the biggest rock group in the world at that time. This is a reggae band called Aswad, London-based.
Groups such as Aswad and the performers such as Linton Wasey and Johnson merged out of the Jamaica culture influence, which had become a feature of the radicalized black young culture. It shared with the punk orientation of the street and a determination to generate the language forms appropriate to it.
This is a photograph of the late 70s of black youth who were living in a hostel, but they developed their own very distinctive clothing. Sort of, they'd often wear suits without shirts. Um, this is Linton Kwesi Johnson, who's a performance poet, performance artist and poet. And it's corresponded to a lot of street politics and um, kind of combating police on the streets.
Derek Jarman had a background in set design, but he was increasingly drawn into filmmaking in 1970s. He was also a young pioneer of music videos, working with the Marian Faithfull and her recording Broken English 1979.
Derek Jarman was the same generation as Hockney, but he did designs initially for um, film and opera stage sets. But he developed a practice of with 8mm film. He started filming events of his life, and he then started to make mainstream films. So Jubilee was one of his first. It's like a post-punk film.
There is a Derek Jarman exhibition and the movie happening in Wellington, New Zealand. So I went to see his film, was it Edward II, about a month ago, and there's a gallery visit scheduled next week in Wellington, New Zealand. I just wonder whether there is any tour going on, like New Zealand or Australia, of Derek Jarman's work. Because usually these things happen not just one country, but they go on tour, like Asia tour, Singapore, Hong Kong, or Austria, New Zealand. Anybody knows?
No.
No? Okay.
This is a film on Francis Bacon called Love is the Devil by John Maybury. John Maybury went to St. Martin's, was part of a generation of post-punk. They started their own clubs and did use film as backdrops for various bands. So St. Martin's was the centre of this sort of crossover between fashion and art and film.
Mabry released the film Love as the Devil in 1998, which highlighted the transgressive elements of his life and had returned him into a quarter figure for the emerging generation of the artist. Starting in the first part of the 1980s, Gary began to be the center of what was termed as the New British Sculpture, and the British Council promoted this as the movement in conjunction to the neo-expressionist painting within an international context. This also coincided with the idea related to postmodernism, which led to the embrace of the hybridity and the fragment as the principle for the construction of the artwork. Within this, there was no insistence of the stylistic consistency, which has been the case within the modernist art. Instead, the idea of the zeitgeist of the mood of the period was the thing to be prevail.
This is Bill Woodrow. He made sculptures out of the street. He found his materials on the thrown away detritus, and I think he had a studio in Brixton.
Bill Woodrow, Element 1, 1984. Chirac House Sherry is the Iranian artist who made London into her center. She is influenced by ideas related to the Sufism.
Is Anish Kapoor. So they're very unlikely to make a movement. It was very unlikely. They were very diverse in their approaches to sculpture. Didn't seem to be a movement at all, but it became concocted into a movement. And at that time, the person who was most unlikely to be famous was Anish. He seemed to be most marginal of all the artists, but he became the leading figure of the Lisson school.
In 1979, the book, The Postmodern Condition, was published by John Francis Letard. His thesis was that all the major discourse related to modernism, such as progress, high and low culture, possessive individualism, and had become obsolete in the face of the hybrid forms of the expression based on the new technologies. Writing about art became a source of the textual invention in order to respond to the breaking down of the authority that might be claimed by any intervention within the work of art. The idea of stylistic borrowing from the different cultural realms started to become the making of its own style. Mona Hatton, light sentence, 1992. Mona Hatton applied for UK residency in 1970s because of the war in Lebanon. Her work developed out of the hybrid mixture of the surrealism and the minimalism. Saatchi's gallery at Boundary Road introduced a new level of exhibiting work into the London art scene. The space was expensive and the light mixed in industrial and gallery lighting together. Many of exhibitions served as essays on the rationale for the construction of the work, which attracted the considerable press attention. This space was able to project a vision of the most recent projections of art in ways that then Tate appeared either unwilling or unable to amount. Over this period, such heads amassed a collection of recent art that drove the national holding of the like art.
So he literally became the most important figure in dictating the present reception of art in London. And he was a copywriter, Saatchi, but he used his connections with the press to use the popular press for promoting art. So Damien Hirst, when they showed the shop, I think the Sun termed it a load of fish and chips. But it got publicity and popular in the Sun and the Daily Mail and those sorts of level of press. So it's the first time since pop art that there was a sort of popular outlook on the work.
So was it just a happy coincidence that you had Hirst, who was a fantastic marketer, combined with someone who wanted to create a collection and create wealth and had contacts, and it just all sort of intersected at that point?
Hirst learned from Saatchi. I don't think he had the sense, I think, already, but he learned very quickly the techniques of marketing and publicity.
And also Saatchi and Saatchi Advertising Agency, of course, or Saatchi and Charles Saatchi, they are the marketers themselves to start with.
There's a magazine called ZG, Zeitgeist, which was based in London and New York and mainly featured covers which were New York artists, so Cindy Sherman and Robert Longo.
Does it still exist, this magazine?
No, it only lasted for about 12, 14 editions,
Okay.
but influenced a lot of the ways in which people wrote about art. It was an unusual format,
It's non-commercial, isn't it?
non-commercial. Someone else read.
Each magazine.
Someone else read now. You've done well.
Sorry for mispronounced the name.
Okay, I can read.
Okay.
ZG magazine was a publication of the early 1980s, which was associated with postmodern approaches to writing on cultural forms that broke down the usual or presumed hierarchies of high and low culture. In general terms, it utilized ways of addressing image culture rather than traditional modes of thinking about medium distinctions. Each copy was based upon distinct themes, such as desire or future dread. The editorial was based jointly in London and New York, but the venture was short-lived due to economic constraints.
It was started in St. Martin's. Which was generative of a whole lot of projects around this time.
When did St. Martin's School get established? Was it in the 60s or before that?
I mean, its fame started in the 60s with people like Anthony Caro and Philip King. And then the conceptual generation and minimalist generation. And then for its performative fashion. And it was the first to really start the idea of cultural studies. A lot of people went to study in St. Martin's just to do the cultural studies course. This is Tracy Emin and Sarah Lucas. They bought they hired a shop on Bethnal Green Road and sold little artifacts, and Tracy would sell she'd offer to write 5 letters to you for a fee, maybe £100 for 5 letters. Or
I just did a Google, the Central St. Martin's at 1854. It's a, University of Art, as you know.
But the period in which it was really famous was the 1970s.
When Tracy Emin and Sarah Lucas hired a rundown shop in Bethnal Green, they introduced a fresh approach to generating a social model for art. The East End saw a whole network of galleries, studios, networks, and projects. West End galleries started to open out spaces in the East, and a price inflation followed. The idea of the difference between East and West became an imaginary construct as a structural one, but it served to revitalise the art world for a short period of time.
I mean, literally, you saw buyers turning up in their limousines to buy art, hot off the press in the East End at that time. Here's Tracy Emin's tent, which was destroyed in a fire in the Saatchi Gallery. Lost most of its holdings.
The YBA generation introduced a shorthand for their work. Artifacts became known as Tracy's tent, Damien's shark, Rachel's house, Quinn's bloody head, which gave the respective art a populist facade and linked art to other fashionable discourses. In this way, there was an anti-establishment flavour to much of the language that became associated with this tendency.
When Saatchi opened the Boundary Road, he asked Damien if he could make any work of art, if he had the money, what would he make? He said, I want to do a shark. It'll cost $25,000 to do it. And Saatchi said, here's the $25,000, do it. And the rest is history. This is Rachel Reed's house. Ghost. Mark Quinn's Bloodhead.
Julian Opie painted portraits of the band Blur for the 2000 recording. Socially, the YBA and Blur became closely associated with the West End bars and clubs. In this way, the YBA had become a milieu and lifestyle. Charles Saatchi had made his reputation as a major collector and figure related to the 1980s image-based art, with such figures as Julian Schonebel and Aslan Kiefer. He built a reputation for buying cheap and selling high through the secondary market. After the economic crash, he turned his attention to young London-based artists utilising ways of promoting the artist in what became known as Brit Art or YBA. His intuition about the market realised immense returns, and he became the most important figure in the global art scene. London was one of the centres for exhibiting and collecting of Eastern art forms. Howard Hodgkin was a major collector of Indian and Persian paintings, and Anish Kapoor likewise has formed a major collection of Indian sculpture. The artist as a collector has always become a constant feature of art, but the way cities make this possible is of interest. London has exerted major influence as a global arts centre, due in part to the attraction of London art schools that served as a magnet for young aspiring artists, especially from the Far East. The competition between these schools provided for the circulation of different cultures and networks that facilitated a transition to the broader art world. If one took a city to be both a place but also a state of mind, then London starts to assume ubiquity because it is without a measurable boundary. Art follows capital, but also capital follows art in an open exchange of forces. And the circularity lies at the root of the way the idea of the contemporary has come to be defined. Chris Offley, The Holy Virgin Marty, 1996. Major artists increasingly work in different cities and museums, increasingly utilize the relationship of contemporary art as a signpost for cultural relevance. This is having a profound effect upon the aesthetic relevance and profile of artists. The growth of tourism related to art has become a major driver within the profiles of various cities. New spaces for the display of art have stimulated the ambition related to the spectacle of art, and this is invariably understood as the basis of expanding value within city spaces. The establishment of the Second Tate Gallery to feature contemporary art has served to provide a focal point in the capital for the exploration of global developments. The opening presentation in the Turbine Space as a massive bronze sculpture by Louise Bourgeois. Did I hear wrongly, but is it coming back to the Turbine this year in May? Or is that in my dreams?
No, it is for the 20th anniversary, I think. They're going to reinstall it.
Mm.
Certainly was a major. I mean, it was something which is undreamt of on the scale, and just have a showing space which could facilitate a project like that.
What diverse arts such as Paulo Rego, Peter Doig, and Enrico David have in common is that they all used London as a staging post for their aesthetic development, despite the fact that they belong by birth to other countries. The network of galleries and museums all serve as a stimulus, alongside the intellectual inquiry that goes with this desire to belong. Structurally, it is possible to have a studio in any place, and a sign of success is to have multiple places for studios. But this abstracts away the question of identity and memory formed within the idea of a primary place. London still serves as a density of attributes, but without a secured root system to lend it consistency, linking memory and place together as a stable identity.
Peter Doig, Rico David.
Since the 1990s, London has become the major city in Europe for contemporary art. The growth of the auction house influence had a marked effect on the staging of art as an economic spectacle, and the idea of a portfolio of investments led to a massive growth of the market. Brexit, though, has served to destabilise this pattern, with galleries shifting attention to Paris as an alternative to London. So the question that faces London as an art capital, will it be able to survive this economic downturn, which will surely become a dent in its future? Perhaps it will continue in part as memories scatter in different host cities, as a destination to view its various archives, or as a facility for fragmentary career paths, but no longer a city of unified destiny or certainty. Thank you, Jonathan. That has been a really, really interesting presentation. I have one question. I'm jumping in here. There's been a mention of a variety of art schools. So we've got Slade, St Martin's, RCA, and that's some School of Art. How much have the schools influenced, or have the artists, the working artists influence the schools, and how is it all of that linked, especially being in London, a vibrant sort of cultural centre where new ideas are being tested out?
There's no other city with such a network of art schools. It played an essential role in post-war English culture because it led to a growth of, just the development of modern photography, advertising culture. About 12% of the economy is cultural, generated by art schools. It was most successful in Europe. No one exceeds 12% of the economy. And that's down to the dynamism of art schools in that period. You could say in the 60s, the Royal College was the dominant force. In the 70s, St. Martin's. It passed from culture to culture. The Slade was important in the 70s. Goldsmiths was important in the 90s. Royal College was very important in the early 21st century. There's a crisis of art schools now. There's a crisis in London to do with the cost of studio spaces. So it looks like London's going to lose its attractiveness to people wanting to come and study art. It's got major structural problems. But certainly, if you look at the post-war years, the generation of new forms of art, new forms of expression, the integration between commercial and fine art spheres. It's partly an essay to do with these interactions, and they're particularly London-based. And a lot of people studied in London have gone back to various cities like Berlin and taken London with them. So London's an idea as much as it's a physical entity. And it was so unpromising in the early part of the 20th century.
I'd like to add also, if I may, maybe 2 points. One was that during the presentation, there was part in the slide UK artist, art school drawing young artists, students from especially Far East. And I can really relate to that. Names like Hockney or Trace Emin or even Ridley Scott all contribute to this reputation of RCA compared to Slade or Goldsmith. Of course, they're very important. So that's the first point that I wanted to mention. I don't know when Hockney dies or Ridley Scott goes, there'll be some people still around. But second point I want to say is also traveling to Australia and US very recently, names like Kara Walker or say Julie Meredith, these people are all very strongly represented in the global art scene. I think that might be also happening when those names that I mentioned earlier sort of disappear from the art scene, and these people, Kara Walker or Julie Meredith, I think they're 50s, so they will be around for a while, and they might get more well-known global dominance, and then people from backgrounds like Ethiopia or that sort of things. I think it's an emerging trend as I see what's happening to a 10, to a 20, to a 30s. So that's something that I thought perhaps we can touch based at some point. What is happening 2000 to 10 to 20s.
Karen, what do you think?
I guess Johnny's question is sort of touching on a couple of things that just, forgive me, but Kara Walker's not British, is she, or is she?
Isn't she American?
Yeah, I think she's American. Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly
Yeah,
deals
that's
with
what I'm saying, that
American slavery.
Yes, those names. In my case, what attracted me to RCA was all those names. Even Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, those names. But what I'm trying to say is, say 30, 40, 50 years ago, those names, so they're all very active. Tracy Emin is still very active. But now these people out of US or some other background, the international art scene wouldn't be dominated by these names. That's what I'm trying to say.
So your question is that globally there are other names that are coming to the fore now that aren't necessarily based in the London scene, based through by either being British or studying here or practicing here. Is that what you're
Yeah,
asking?
that's already what Jonathan has already saying, that London is losing. That those appeal to art schools are disappearing. The cost of living is high, and people are a lot more mobile. Berlin, definitely. I was in Berlin 2 years ago, and even people from, yes, so one of my classmates from RCA was moved to Berlin at the time, and very active. He's got African background.
So I think there's a difference between the physical place of London and um, the sense of it being an image or imaginary city.
What was like the Golden Smiths before the YBA period?
I mean, it was known as a certain conceptual. It had a sort of root in conceptual art. A lot of conceptual artists went through Goldsmiths in the 70s. But it wasn't particularly centre to the London scene. It was the YBA which made it, gave it incredible image, very confident. It completely dominated the London art scene for about 20 years.
Was that encouraged by their teacher Martin Crete Martin back to that
I mean, he's an
time?
important figure. I mean, he just had um, I mean, he knew how to promote art. He gave that generation a sense of, he gave them an address book. You need to know these people to get into the frame. When Damien Hirst did his show, um, he gave him an address book. He said, there's 6 or 7 people you need to get in touch with. Ring them up. Tell them Michael has given you his number.
But wasn't that
Not
active
many people saw the show,
marketing,
but
right?
six, 7 people did. Sensation show.
They also drove around to people's places and knocked on doors.
Yeah, he drove. He would offer to drive people to see the show.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, Jonathan, about Listen Gallery?
Listen, it started. Nicholas Logsdale was a student in the Slade, and he didn't think he was good enough to become an artist, but he admired various fellow students, and he thought he'd set up a gallery. And the only place he could afford was run down Listen Street in Paddington. It was a solicitor's office, 2 up, 2 down. And he started on a I mean, he had a little bit of money. And he showed artists like Derek. The first exhibition I saw there was Derek Jarman. But he showed conceptual artists like Sol LeWitt. So he was the first to show conceptual art in London. I think Saatchi was one of his clients, but he found it really tough going in the 70s. He almost went bankrupt. And then he hit upon this new generation of sculptors. And I mean, they all brought along their mates, as it were. And soon he had about 12 sculptors who were all making column inches in reviews. And I think it was Michael Newman was working as a voluntary worker there who would write about the shows and come up with terms to do with postmodernity and hybridity. And he kind of gave it a unified feeling subliminally. So they thought they've got a kind of movement there. And the British Council always had an eye for sculpture. So Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, one generation, second generation, Anthony Caro, Philip King, third generation, Barry Flanagan and Gilbert and George. Fourth generation, Listen School. And there was a lot of shows around abroad which had German neo-impressionism, and American neo-expressionism, and British sculpture. So it became an international known place, and then the rest is history. It scaled up, and he became, in a way, a billionaire through just showing art.
I just wanted to. Okay, sorry.
Go on.
No, I was just going to talk about a show that was on last year at the Tate. British women artists from 1960 to 1980. And it was packed with hundreds of artists. And I just wondered if you'd been to the show, and I sort of loved your presentation, but I found it skewed, if you like, towards talking about a lot of male artists. And it's sort of, just wondered if you'd thought about that or.
I didn't see the show.
No, it's a big show, an important show.
What was it called again?
British Women Artists, 1960 to 80, I think. I'd have to just double check on the dates.
It was on at the Tate.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Tate Modern. And it showed a lot of black women artists as well, and very important at the time, a lot of photographers, filmmakers, whole variety.
I mean, they're rewriting history a lot of the time now.
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of revisionism is occurring, in which
Yes.
figures who were major figures at the time have disappeared and marginal figures have become major figures. It's amazing the reversals in cultural value.
Well, I think there's been an acknowledgement that these artists didn't necessarily get the attention that they should have had at the time. Not all of them. I mean, some big names in there as well. But yeah, I hear you.
I mean, you've got to remember with the post-war generation of the London School. I mean, in the 60s, they were ignored. I mean, Bacon had times when he was seen as sort of an obsolete figure. He's had extraordinary turnaround. He became very fashionable with the YBA, just out of his lifestyle, his attitude of anti-establishment.
Yeah.
And his clubbing and hanging out with gangsters and it's peculiar how artists go in and out of fashion and how major fashion movements transform what's seen and what's shown.
It's interesting too tonight, this notion of a network rather than a movement. This notion of sort of people hanging together, they're not necessarily grouping aesthetically, but then or with a mission as such, but aesthetically they're interested in exploring sort of similar notions or similar ideas. It's something new to think about tonight.
I think that's what London was specialised in, as a city, building networks and lifestyles, and as a unitary, almost a fictional art scene, rather than one which is structurally, aesthetically coherent.
And is that because we're coming from different places? We're arriving with a different requirement or a different background when we're coming to it?
It's a melting pot. London's everyone passes through at some point or has a episode.
And Jonathan, what do you think about the places like Margate or Hastings in terms of the art scene moving to those kind of cities in the UK?
Well, I think London is a difficult city now, and a lot of artists have relocated. And so less obvious centres of showing art have sort of become elevated. A lot of it's also, I mean, Hastings and South Coast is a lot of artists who've almost made it their mission to move out of London decenter.
But I think they still reconvene in London, though. Do you know? Because, like, it's the centre. Like, you get Margate and Hastings are far apart, as is, you know, the other.
Well, Margate is very much the initiative of Tracy Emin.
Yeah.
Without her, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily work.
It's got a nice community, but it's also a satellite to a centre, right?
I mean, there's a centre in around Tracy Emin, not Tracy Emin, Sarah Lucas in Norfolk. There's various art projects which occur there. So this is why I mean London's a state of mind as much as a structural physical entity.
And do you think as we are more virtual, like that state of mind is, you know, that's increasingly the important aspect, you know, and then we meet in these centres? It changes the, you know, you don't have to be in London physically to connect with those people all the time. The other, your, like those people, your peers, you know, your creative peers, it's global, right?
I'm expecting China. A lot of the art world is partly people who studied in UK, in London.
Like what we're doing here as well, like is kind of a virtual network community or potential movement
Probably
even.
wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Zoom.
Or London, like some sort of hybrid space. Somehow kind of depended on the physicality as well. In the beginning, would you say?
I agree. And then I think when we meet up for exhibitions or suppers or whatever we do, then that just sort of fortifies it and helps to strengthen it, that connection and that ability to then feel free to sort of share with each other more honestly.
Yeah, even though it's international. So yeah, there is this kind of, yeah. Interesting possibilities.
I mean, I meet on every other Friday in Beijing with a group of ex-RCA students who have formed a network there.
Nice. Maybe you could get us all together some occasionally, you know.
How does the group differ, Jonathan? And the meeting?
Not so different. Same sort of materials, different nuance in discussion, different characters.
Perhaps a different culture of doing things.
But a definite identity which comes partly from being in London at some point. So this sense of living in two cities at once.
Could we call it post-Londonism or something?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what London's going to become is post-London.
That's Jonathan's lecture next week.
I couldn't do it in a week.
I'm just teasing.
I know, but I like the tease. I mean, the tease is where things start.
But I always thought when I left London, when I first came to London, when I was leaving it, it was like a drug. London was like a drug in your veins. You hated it and you loved it, and as you left it, you wanted to be back for more of it. But it was a really difficult thing to live with. Yeah, I think it's a drug.
Which is in your head. I mean, it's interesting. There's no really huge intellectual figure in London, and there's no figure like Saatchi anymore. There's big anonymous conglomerates who suck up global art and put it into storage spaces, creating investment portfolios. I mean, Saatchi Foundry just couldn't compete with that level of finance that hit the market.
So, what remains of his collection? Do you know?
I mean, he sold a lot of the Brit art. He's sold most of it. I mean, he's still got work from the 80s, Basilette, Kiefer's, but he worked with Gagosian. Gagosian was a secondary art dealer to begin with, and Gagosian sold his collections secretly in the 80s. And so the alliance between Gagosian and Saatchi was very important in the rise of Gagosian. Gagosian started selling posters originally. I mean, it's an incredible story of growth, of capitalization, which is parallel to social media growth.
It'd make a great film, wouldn't it? The sort of great characters involved and the sort of the build up and the expansion of the art market and the sort of deflating or the explosion of it. It's quite a good story.
Mm. I mean, on the whole, they operate far beyond national institutions.
And nothing's regulated, right? So there's no regulation involved.
Yeah.
Wild West and buyer beware.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's temperamental, it's a lot of risk. So the big operators minimize risk.
So Saatchi's the best character for that, right? If he can buy it in, he's got an eye, buy it in, inflate it through the PR and the ability that he has in that machine to know what to do, build up the profile of the artist, and then sell it on without anybody knowing.
I think they used to see it as the kiss of death, Saatchi collecting your degree show work, right? There was something like that.
He'd dump it.
Yeah.
He famously, in the 80s, he bought a lot of pattern paintings from a gallery, which looked like they were going to become very successful. And then when the market went wrong, he rang up the gallery and said, if you don't buy back all the work I bought from you at cost, I'll dump it on the market and destroy you. So he's famous for being kind of really ruthless. And he'd buy work en masse and periodically dump it. You just put it in auction and let it crash. So a lot of artists went from very stable middle market careers to zero. It's very dangerous.
Mm.
But he could afford to. He was making such big profits on the work which was successful that he could dump. I mean, not everyone could just keep buying. Everything comes up trumps. So he had a way of just disposing work.
So what does that mean? I mean, like just on the commercial aspect of like, you know, art, like what's the vulnerability there? It's like if somebody collects all your work, that's the vulnerability, is it? That we
what happens a lot of the time is people buy in networks. So six collectors will get together and buy a certain artist, just informal conversation. I'm buying so and so, and they buy into it, and someone else buys into it, and the price goes up because 6, 7 people are enough to make a movement in the market. So it attracts attention. Other people jump in, and then there's a conversation a year later: do we hold or do we flip or do we hold? So if they flip, they put it into auction mainly and make money. If they hold, they increase the value. But it's a bit of a lottery.
Can you hear me right? It's not had to change my microphone.
For artists.
I was offered a bit of advice recently, actually, that, you know, if you have like certain signature pieces, you should just hold on to them. You just don't let them go. You have to like have sort of, not obviously that you can't stop things selling, but you've got to have these. Like I've got 2 really big sculptures that this dealer was saying, don't sell those. You have to hold on to those. Those are something you must never ever let go of. And you let go of them much later in your life, or I don't know. I just thought it was quite interesting because it kind of made sense, because I realised that if I did sell those things, I mean, the opportunity hasn't arisen, by the way, but if I did sell those things, I would never ever be able to bring them back together again and make sense of, you know, on a personal level. But he was talking about value system. He was talking about keeping hold of something. And I don't, is it Scully that did that?
Who?
Scully, is his name Scully, the
Scully.
painter? Yeah, Sean Scully. He kept a lot of his work, his original work, so that it didn't, he wasn't vulnerable like that. He was very, very careful about what he sold, which I thought was interesting. And I mean, just on another note, I have recently got to know an art advisor who was saying that, you know, really in contemporary art terms, the bottom's falling out of the market for a certain type of contemporary art, and that you just kind of have to wait for that security to come back, because a lot of people who spent a huge amount of money on contemporary art are now trying to sell it back. And the marketplace has just halved. That's particularly a well-known thing at the moment.
It's a lot of work you've bought in the past. You can't put it through the auction houses because they say we indefinite numbers of mass produce the same dot paintings by Hirst is
exactly.
they're unsaleable.
Yeah.
Wants them because they know that you can have one produced willy-nilly.
Yeah, and there's a trust. You know, there's a trust between the buyer and the artist. And I think it's been a bit broken by people, producing things en masse. Maybe, I don't know.
I mean, a lot of work is unmanageable as far as restoration is concerned.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
You buy it and it's going to cost you thousands to maintain it. I know someone who bought a Anish Kapoor a blue dish, and it collects dust, and it's impossible to clean, so it looks grubby. or Kiefer's paintings, blobs tend to fall off them, mud and straw mixed with paint. It's not stable. Turns to dust eventually.
Well, don't we all?
Yeah, people don't invest in us when we become obsolete and old. And certainly is not a health service to restore us.
See, this is why Abby is really clever. I think her sculpture cow, when Damien Hirst's shark sculpture can no longer be afforded to be done, cow will just slot right in there. Last for hundreds of years. So Abby's ahead of the market.
With any luck, its legs won't fall off or anything like that.
No, they're plastic, aren't they?
Yeah, no, it'll hold together, but I have to say, storing it in my studio is a big industrial space which is cold and damp. So who knows what's going to happen to it?
But you just buy some more IKEA rugs, recoat it.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's true. I could. I'm just crossing my fingers that they aren't going mouldy. That's all I can do because I've got nowhere else to put them.
I think a cow out in the field doesn't go moldy.
Yeah, I know, but it's not under a bit of tarpaulin and a bit of.
Yeah, fair point.
We need a wild parlour storage unit somewhere, not Margate.
Don't we just? Yeah, don't we just?
Temperature controlled.
Yeah.
Well, in London, maybe that can be our anchor, a storage unit.
Big yellow.
Yeah.
Well, if we have a storage unit that's in a low-cost destination, we could afford the studio space in London.
Yeah, good point.
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing next week? It's 8 o'clock.
You mentioned you had another PowerPoint, Jonathan, the other day?
Did we do memory?